Without addressing restoration or management needs, and without providing interpretation, we inadvertently present forest conditions to the public that are neither natural nor beneficial. Welcome to Dirt Magic, a podcast chronicling the Sierra Beach Trail Stewardship's mission of building sustainable recreation-based communities through stewardship, job creation, and world-class events, providing quality outdoor experiences through trail construction and maintenance in the Lost Sierra. I'm your host, Martin Scheel. On this episode of Dirt Magic, we will be discussing forest stewardship and how looking to the past may help protect the future of our forested public lands. Our guests today have a combined dossier of experience that would rival any renowned institution of learning. Together, they are a visionary that collected the right ingredients to create a 20-plus year trail stewardship organization, a self-funded professional mountain bike adventurer who for over 25 years has dabbled in forestry and fire to pay for his bikes and parts, and a registered professional forester with decades of experience in resource management, fire ecology, environmental policy, and still had time to author more than 20 scientific papers. You might call this group the dream team of our forested public lands. Please welcome SBTS Executive Director Greg Williams, CAL FIRE Staff Chief of Wildfire Resilience, Stew McMorrow, and co-founder of the Natural Hazards Team and Operations Manager at Spatial Informatics Group, Jason Moghaddas. Gentlemen, welcome to Dirt Magic. Greg, Stu, Jason, thanks for joining us today. I've been really excited about this show. We're going to be digging into the topic, or a portion of the topic of forest stewardship. I know a topic that everyone on this call is familiar with on a day-to-day basis. But before we get to the nitty-gritty, just maybe go ahead and each of you give me a brief introduction of yourself, what you do, and your connection to trail stewardship and even fire. And we can keep this one brief. And Greg, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm instigator of Sierra Beach Trail Stewardship and responsible for day-to-day operations and relationship building, I would say, with land managers and community leaders.
Well, that's a tough job in and of itself. I'm sure you know better than just about anybody. And Stu?
My name's Stew McMorrow, and I often like to say I'm a self-funded professional mountain biker, and I moonlight by doing forestry and fire type work with CAL FIRE. And so with CAL FIRE, I manage a lot of private land ownership, forestry issues, and reforestation type work. And I've been a firefighter for 25 years.
Wow, well, you've definitely seen the transformation of fire in the past couple of decades. Unfortunately, not for the better. That's for sure. And last but certainly not least, Jason.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Jason with Spatial Informatics Group, and I work with them as a fire ecologist and forester. Lived in Plumas County about 20 years, and have done firefighting in my youth up here in prescribed burning. A lot of my work now is really fire hazard assessment, mitigation planning for communities and agencies and other landowners. I also like to bike, and I just did pick up an e-bike, which I love.
Oh, yes, boy, it's the e-biking trend. I'm glad to see that keep climbing. It really puts a lot more people out on trails and out in the forest. Maybe some that normally wouldn't get out on trails and ride their bikes. And I think for today's topic, it's very important because the public and public buy-in and those that use our forests are some of our biggest supporters, and we definitely need more, both boots on the ground and financially. Well, gentlemen, today, the impetus of today's show, really stems from the post-Dixie fire recovery, and for really any fire recovery that we've been experienced, over the last decade for sure, and looking to the future of forest stewardship, management, looking to the past potentially to help benefit our futures. And I'll start off with this, I would say, rather disturbing statement, and it's from the SBTS Connected Communities Trails Master Plan draft. And I'll just roll with this. It says, without addressing restoration or management needs, And without providing interpretation, we inadvertently present forest conditions to the public that are neither natural nor beneficial. And, for me, that leads me directly. It's like an arrow pointing directly to mega fire, which is unfortunately a household term now, that really didn't even exist, just beyond a decade ago. But Stu, when you hear those words, for someone that literally can be on the front line of fire any given day, even as we speak, what do those words mean to you, especially where it's, conditions to the public that are neither natural nor beneficial. And that natural part's kind of interesting because everybody would just think that the forest is natural, but it's not so natural as it should be.
Yeah, you actually hit it right on the head there, Marty, with that natural piece. And how that strikes me is interesting. It's, we are, by creating these trails and inviting people into the forest to go enjoy themselves there, the public are they're all armchair foresters, right? Every single person out there seems to think they know what needs to happen with the forest, and in a lot of cases, ignorance like that is normal and natural. They don't know any better, and because they just see what the forest is in front of them, and then as soon as something changes in that forest, that's when they think, okay, that's bad, right? Or if we do a harvest in the forest or a thinning or sometimes even prescribed fire, there are folks out there that don't think that's the right thing to do because they don't have any other reality to compare that against. And when we talk to some of our tribal elders and others who have been managing forests for a long time, they speak about how the forest was much different and managed much differently based on what they need. And so this concept of fire hardened trails gives us this opportunity to start changing that narrative, tell a different story about forestry. And I think it's just such an awesome way to educate the public by having them be out there in the forest, having a good time, and learning a little bit more about what forest conditions can be, right? How they should be a little bit different. Natural is a hard thing to get around. Nature never really circles back to what it was after disturbance. But we can certainly change that narrative by doing our part as stewards of the trails and helping out those stewards of the landscape through the stuff that we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, very good points, and which brings us to the theme of this show, and you mentioned it, fire hardened trails. And this is something I know that both you and Jason, along with others like Ryan Tompkins, Jeff Dupras, that formerly worked for us and is retired from U.S. Forest Service Fire. But post Dixie Fire, I was in with our trail crew and a camera crew up on Mount Huff, and just seeing the devastation firsthand, before the public was allowed in. For obvious reasons. I mean, the widowmaker trees that our crews were dropping alongside, Forest Service workers too, it was amazing to me. It looked like a different planet. And, over time, I think, really Greg's vision, as it always does with the stewardship, the thoughts start rolling out, some ideas starts rolling out. And usually it's conversations with folks like you. And Greg, this fire hardened trail, which we're going to dig into, what was the spark, so to speak, that brought it to your attention? And when you brought it to us, said, hey, SBTS team, we need to look at this. We've got some partners out there with a vast amount of knowledge. But yeah, what was the impetus of you bringing this to the stewardship?
Yeah, I think it was like sitting there and watching. I mean, you couldn't see Mount Huff from Quincy because the smoke was so thick, but knowing what was happening out there on an area that, was at that point pretty near and dear to all of our hearts. We had been working out there for almost a decade, trying to get trails going, and then, learned that it was on fire. And then, later learning like they were backfiring off the trails and, using the trails as anchor points and just being strategic with the trails that were there, laying hose down the trails. And, it wasn't too long after really I reached out to Jason and to Ryan Tompkins and just, at the office, we just sat there, like we had a couple beers and just talked about like, what does the future look like? Like, can trails be a part of fuels management and, community protection and ingress and egress for firefighters? And then also just this whole like education piece of like, how do we change people's minds and perspectives about healthy forests through trails? So it was really just like a big brainstorm with like, Jason and Ryan, who are super smart about this subject.
Yeah, they're boy, their decades of experience, together are, and of course along with Stu too from the fireside as well, and for stewardship, is pretty amazing. Even more so amazing to have that located in such a small geographic region here in Plumas County, have access to that type of experience, and all those years of investment into their work and into the forest and public lands. And, Jason, all this next statement also comes from, our Connected Communities Trails Master Plan draft. And this is a short paragraph that gives a definition of fire hardened trails. But after that, after I read it, I think you could probably put it into a little better layman's terms for those that aren't used to the big wordy definitions. But here it goes. Fire hardened trails serve as multifunctional spaces that cater to both environmental conservation and community well being. They're designed to provide a harmonious blend of nature and recreation, promoting a healthier lifestyle while preserving and enhancing the natural environment. To me, that's pretty self-explanatory, but I look at this stuff every day. But for someone that has never heard of fire hardened trail, what does that really mean in layman's terms?
Yeah, I like how you phrase that, and it's really a more holistic view of what trails are. I think there's a lot of parallels between, fuel breaks we think of, standard thinning and prescribed fire projects, usually along roads, and then fire hardened trails. And we've been starting to talk about fuel breaks more about the different functions they serve during their life cycle, which I see a lot, with these trails. So, in the planning phases, these actually can bring communities together, raise awareness both about fire, forestry, and recreation. As you go through planning to implementation, both types of projects provide work. So I know your trails provide work to a real workforce of both teens and adults, so like real jobs for people. And then the experience people have as they go through these, everyone has a different experience on the Mount Huff Trail, but we all use it, and we love it. And then there's what happens with these things, sort of before a fire. They both can provide access, improve access for firefighters or people trying to get away from the fire. And of course, when the fire burns through, there's chances to catch it there or reduce its burn severity or effects. And then after the fire, and I think the Mount Huff Trail is a great example of what you don't want after a fire, where you basically lose the forest completely around that trail. And now you have a multi-year sort of mitigation, cleanup, even reforestation. A lot of that could have been mitigated if, the trails were fire hardened, obviously before the fire, to the degree they could have moderated some of that behavior. And I think a great example to where Mount Huff Trail could be going is really the Taylor Antelope Lake Trail, which burned in about 2001 or two. And that's sort of, and maybe Greg could speak to this, but an ongoing kind of brush management issue. It's not conducive for mountain biking and even walking, I think, anymore.
Yeah, and we will definitely we'll definitely get into that with Greg. And Stu, here's a question. Earlier this year, I was at the Fire Safe Council. Had a day out at the Plumas Sierra County Fairgrounds to really help teach folks about their own personal properties, how to fire harden their properties, and do the normal things that we see every day in and out. You see it on TV and ads. But one question that came up, and we had some early graphics of what the prescription would look like from the trail itself, and the fuels management and tree management. But I would still get asked the question inherently, every third person. Well, so you're creating a fire break, like a dozer line. And of course, I would have to say no, but still trying to explain the difference of what we're trying to accomplish. And so, Stu, I mean, for the most part, people think of a fire line. All they think of is dozers. They think the dozer goes in there 6 or 7 wide, takes it all the way down to dirt, which of course we know happens in the forest during fires. But a fire hardened trail isn't necessarily a fire break or fire line.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of times we think of fire breaks as basically a zone of death, a big dirt pathway, right? We see that on fires a lot across ridge lines. And unfortunately, some of our trails go across those same ridge lines. And when fire crews are out there, getting with it, going after the fire, they don't have a lot of time to really be strategic about trying to go around trails and whatnot. But so unfortunately, we lose some good trail work out of that. But what a fire hardened trail really is I would characterize it as somewhat of a shaded fuel break. It's not a fire break, it's a fuel break. So we're trying to slow the path of the fire down a little bit, slow down the intensity of the fire. And it's very much a vegetated situation. In fact, it's, in the aftermath of a fire on a fire hardened trail, we can actually go back in and do revegetation along the trail. And in doing so, we're actually reducing the probability that another fire would happen by putting in and maintaining the vegetation that we can get to grow. But getting back to your question about, is this a fire break, a fuel break? We're really designed it around sort of the defensible space standards and sort of like a vegetation home hardening type of a situation where you're not whacking everything. You're just separating things, separating the big trees from the surface fuels, from the ground fuels, so that fire slows down in that area. It gives our firefighters some confidence that they can get in there and maybe do something, maybe run a hose line in there. And especially under conditions where the fire is less intense already, man, that trail would be just the perfect place probably to maybe even stop it or fire off from, right? So if we don't want no vegetation, because that won't be a very fun trail to ride for starters, and it's much harder to maintain. But we want something that looks good, that keeps ignitions from starting on the trail. Let's not forget about that too. Trail users start fires sometimes accidentally. And this would even help in that regard, but it mostly is helping us to get a handle on the fire and give firefighters a chance to do something there.
Yeah, and Jason too. You'd mentioned, anchor points. Kind of give us a little idea of what that means. I know that's getting more into the fire aspect of it when boots are on the ground. But it is kind of, and Stu touched on this already. But anchor points are very important to fire suppression. And how could one of our fire hardened trails help with that?
Yeah, I think, if we think of those anchor points as for prescribed fire, so these trails could be used ahead as parts of fire lines if those line up with units well. And then I think particularly for local firefighters who know these trail systems are there, it can give them an edge in maybe like initial attack. So if you get, say a hypothetical, someone flicks a cigarette out of a vehicle near this trail or on the trail, they already know that's there and can potentially use that as at least as one side of containment. I do believe there was also a lightning fire up on Huff that they used maybe some of the Indian Falls Trail for several years ago to catch. I believe they cut fire line down along there and maybe a 20-acre piece burned in between, but it allowed them to basically create the top edge of the unit, contain the top edge and then bring the line down to the next road system and let that burn out essentially, versus putting firefighters in probably what could be a hazardous sort of steep condition.
So, I mean, in reality, and I know, and I think I read some documentation too on the was it the Wi-Fi that became part of the Dixie? There was one of those little starts, and I read a piece, and I think it's actually in this documentation here for the Connected Communities Trails Master Plan draft of existing trails being used by the fire personnel, and of course we this prescription of fire hardened trails has not been enacted, at least not on purpose, in any area, of our trails. Maybe by default, there's already been some forest management happening, in and around our trails on Mount Huff. But really, this is another tool in the toolbox. I mean, this isn't the golden goose. It's not the magic fire hose or aircraft. It really is just another tool that we can put in the toolbox, and hopefully don't have to use it for fire suppression, and hopefully that tool will help us prevent those fires. But again, it's just one small component, and I think folks need to understand that, and again, because it's like throwing the pebble into an ocean. and it creates a really small ripple, but, a million pebbles in the ocean are a million ripples. And I think that's what we're trying to get at is, every little small part that we can do to protect our public lands and manage them is what we need to do. Because again, mega fire is, a term that, it scares the hell out of me. And in watching, Patagonia presents fire lines. And one of the native people's consultants within the film Fire Lines, he said that, his ancestors, mega fire, that wasn't a term. It didn't exist. And in reality, it probably didn't even exist when we were children, but it does now for sure.
Yeah, and there's some good precedent for fire hardened trails or fire use trails. I know, just thinking growing up as a kid in the East Bay, there was the fire trail. Everybody rode their bikes on it, and there was a running trail, but it served this function as, letting the local fire departments, maybe Cal Fire had keys to these gates. They could use these trails for wildfire management or these roads. I think the big difference I see with a lot of those is they weren't managed, the fuels weren't managed along those trails. So it was a road through really a thicket. And what we're talking about is actually like an effective or potentially effective fuel break as a trail. But there's some good precedent, but it was mostly associated with roads in the past.
This is something, obviously, when an active fire is burning, and multiple agencies and crews, from aircraft to boots on the ground, they're working the forest, and they're doing things, to help slow down, stop the fire, direct the fire. So there isn't, they don't exactly go out and pull a permit to do these things for obvious reasons. But when we go into the forest, even currently, trail or no trail, my understanding is that, Cal Fire or the Forest Service or municipalities, you can't just go onto our public lands into the forest and start thinning out, small trees. You just can't do that without a rigorous permitting process. Now, would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, and under the fire, the firefighting fight, it's pretty much all hands on deck, get it done, right? And so you're pretty much exempted from the National Environmental Quality Act and the California Environmental Quality Act, right? But when we're getting in there and doing this work ahead of time, we're actually preventing that potential damage that would be caused by that firefight, right? So we're actually doing a really good thing by getting it done ahead of time, so that they don't have to take action that would otherwise require a really rigorous environmental review. Right? They don't have to do that much.
And those environmental reviews are kind of the next topic. And Greg, this is where you come in. As we envision our trail systems and building brand new trail, especially, as we've done here on Mount Huff in Plumas County, we have to go through a rigorous environmental process. And you mentioned it, both the NEPA on the national level and CEQA at the California state level. And so we have to do this already when we build brand new trail. And Greg, with that, for the most part, what's the corridor like when we apply and have the NEPA and CEQA done? I mean, is it 4 feet, 10 feet? I mean, how wide is this corridor that we get approved to build our trail? Because obviously, where we want the trail to go sometimes isn't exactly where it can go, because there may be a giant rock or a giant tree or set of trees that you can't, go through. So what's this corridor width that we work so hard and spend a lot of money on getting approved for trail building?
Yeah, so we're looking at 100-foot wide corridor when we're doing like an optimum location for a trail. So within that corridor, we're doing surveys for wildlife and for botany and archaeology, hydrology. So the idea with the fire hardened trails is to maximize that 100-foot wide corridor that we're doing the surveys in, and to go in and create like I would call it like a park-like setting, almost like a showcase of how the forest used to look 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 10,000 years ago, and use it as a showpiece to educate people. But also, if we can, during the Dixie Fire, I want to say there was like 1,700 miles of dozer line created to try and stop the fire. And a lot of it was on ridge tops, and some of our trails got bulldozed that were on ridge tops. So knowing, hey, we're probably going to see another fire in our lifetime is like, how do we now look at where we place trails? And they probably shouldn't be on the ridge tops where either there's a dozer line or there's a potential for dozer line, because trails are really expensive to build. And so if we have this fire hardened trail prescription that complements the dozer lines that have been put in, that maybe in some cases are 100 yards across, and then you have a treatment that's a healthy forest, this fuel break that can work in conjunction with the dozer line. I think that's where is exciting to me. Is how do we complement each other, and how do we have like fire talk into recreation, and how do we make sure that these trails that we work so hard to build and that the community loves aren't in a place that's going to get bulldozed in the future. Like bringing back Mount Huff it was a lot of work. It was really expensive. It was also amazing how the community came out to get back into the woods and to feel like we were whole again, and back on the land. It was super special. So I think at the end of the day is really, how do we educate people? How do we give these communities a sense of safety and still have really high quality recreation and in a place people want to live in the woods, even though it might catch on fire?
Yeah, it's definitely an excellent point, and I think partnership is key here. I mean, obviously, once, as Stu mentioned, once the fire's going, I mean, those dozers, they're going to do their job, whether it's direct, going right direct before the fire, or contingency lines. I sat on Main Street in Quincy, family and I, and watched the fire make a run, over Huff and Grizzly Ridge multiple times, as it did down in Taylorsville. And, I could see the dozer lights working. I mean, it's that close, and that Dixie fire was approaching, and, we weren't under mandatory evacuation. Thank goodness it didn't come to that for at least downtown Quincy. But, you can see the lights of the dozers working. And, when you see that one that's further down the mountain, you're like, that's it. That's the final contingent. If the fire gets across that, then we're out. Because, I mean, it's coming to town, and there's nothing that's going to stop it at that point. But within that same breath, it would would behoove all trail builders, to make sure that if you are in those areas that there is potential for future fire, is, yeah, let's work with our governmental partners, and let's not build the trail exactly where the most beneficial spot likely would be for a dozer line. That just seems like common sense. But when communication doesn't happen through, and you mentioned it perfectly, through fire to recreation, to community groups, when you get that type of partnership and communication on all levels going, I think we can create something, again, another tool for the toolbox. And definitely with the environmental, I think that's one of the biggest key points. I mean, we have to do it. If we build a trail that's going to be 30 miles long, well, that's 30 miles long of a 100-foot wide corridor that can be a fire hardened trail. And Greg, that's not to say that it's not necessarily our crew that's jumping in there and doing the fire hardened trail. This partnership extends beyond just concept, but actually boots on the ground. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it creates a number of different jobs, with the Forest Service, with local contractors, with some of the tribes now that are getting into underburning. It's really a collaboration around the prescription. And I mean, one thing that's just important is that what we're trying to do right now is get this to be common language in the NEPA documentation and the CEQA documentation that outlines these, activities to happen. So without that language in that NEPA CEQA document, you'd have to do a whole nother NEPA and CEQA separate, So the idea is to get this all included in this first go around. And it doesn't mean every trail is going to work perfectly as a fire hardened trail, but it allows for these activities to happen, which, I mean, in my mind, like, there shouldn't be a trail built that doesn't have this prescription in it. There's no harm to it. It just allows for us to, again, create this healthy environment, this education piece. And, moving forward, I don't want to see another trail built without this.
And Stu, when boots are on the ground with Cal Fire, they're not necessarily always fighting fire. I mean, Cal Fire obviously does a lot of preventative and especially in areas where, uh, if they can do what's, Greg mentioned the word treatment, even, where I live in East Quincy, the private property next to me, the Forest Service, along with a contractor, finally came out, and thank goodness they did, because it was 13 acres of death. I couldn't even see 10 yards into it, and yes, I lose a little bit of privacy, but now I look out at that 13 acres treated, and I know that any fire that starts in there is going to be tiny. It's not going to get up into the treetops and not end up on my roof and take away all of my fire hardening that I've done for my property. So it's not just necessarily during the fire, but for Cal Fire that sends crews out, especially in training, it sounds like a fire hardened trail corridor is a great opportunity, not only for them to learn, but I guess basically practice what they preach.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you were one of the prime folks that learned from this, Marty. In having that little bit of shock in saying, "Oh man, this isn't what it used to be. It's now different, right?" And how am I just gonna live here? How am I gonna change my lifestyle, my expectations for where I live around how the forest has changed a little bit before a fire, right? And it's not just about fire management all the time. It's also a more healthy forest environment too. If we're thinning out the trees a little bit, that's really doing the work that natural fire would have done over millennium, right? Um, and so I really welcome that change in people's mindset, that it's not just about, green doesn't mean healthy all the time. It's lean and green is probably a little more true to form, right? And so when Cal Fire crews, and I want to make sure that we're talking about Forest Service crews also, because the vast majority of these landscapes where we need to do this work is really on public land, and Cal Fire doesn't have as much of a role there. But we're all the same people, right? Fire crews, forest managers, we're all looking for the same outcome. We want to keep forests on the ground. We want to keep them healthy. And we want to have these facilities on the landscape, which are trails and roads. We want to recognize that roads and trails as much as roads, I mean to say, are a facility that we need to respect and utilize and work with. And as Greg brought up, it's this new day for partnerships that we didn't really have before. And that's where I think the beauty of this whole thing happens. And bringing crews out there to learn how to do fuels reduction along trails, the tribal crews, any other crews. It's like a workforce development type of a thing as well. So it's just got so many benefits. And I think what you brought up is an excellent point, Marty. It's like things change behind your house. Things are going to change out in the forest too, and it's a good thing. It's better than black. Dead in black is not good.
Yes, definitely. And that brings me, to my next point, and Jason, you'll be able to touch on this too. Public perception many times, within the forest, the flora, the fauna, the cultural, but specifically, the animals would be one. I'd be talking animals both, on the ground and in the air, and spotted owl, goshawks, bald eagles. I mean, you name it. We live in an area that's rich with just some of the most awesome animal life on the planet. And the NEPA and CEQA, obviously address that, in depthly, with biologists coming out and doing surveys and looking at known nest sites. And there's always this perception that one, you know those systems can shut down a trail or keep us out of an area because of a nesting site. And of course, that's like any other subject when it comes to the forest. You can make it political really fast, and people will draw the line in the sand and not listen to a word that anybody says. But in reality, a black forest that looks like Mars isn't good for any animal or any plant, obviously. um but this fire hardened trail corridor with a prescription, even though the environmental has been done and completed, there's still some animosity. And boy, that's going to come to a pun when I'm talking about the animals. But we are basically taking away the animal's environment within that 100-foot corridor. Now, I don't feel that's true, but again, I'm in this every day. So maybe help us and help the public understand. And Stu mentioned it too, that really the animal management portion of this within this corridor actually goes towards the positive, not the negative.
Yeah, I think what's nice today compared to 20 years ago is we're swimming in data. So we do have really good information on where a lot of things are located and where those are, habitats, potential nest areas, or cultural resources or historic resources where there's been surveys. You do probably have a better ability today to either avoid or know you're going into some of those areas before you lay out your trail. And 25 years ago, that was hard to get at. There was barely GIS. I think it's important to explain, just like you did, sort of the level of disturbance here that comes with the fire. So Greg said, 12, 1,700 miles of dozer line went in a few weeks with really no, whatever was in the way got pushed out of the way. And you got to clean that up. I know a lot of folks on this workforce work cleaning that up afterwards as best you can. So when you're looking at the scale of impact of these trails, I think it's important to scale. You have this distance, say 30 miles, 100 feet wide. How many acres or what percentage of a certain forest type are you affecting? So I'm just making up numbers, but a 10,000 acre planting area, you might be disturbing a few hundred acres. And then of those acres, what percentage of that's actually in, known habitat or nest areas versus just in a general forest type? Or, are you going through riparian areas? Like all these things, you can start to account for these acres and the percentage of acres that you could potentially disturb. And then you're really then describing the magnitude of impact. So like with a trail, are you equivalent to a dozer line? Definitely not. Are you equivalent to a road? Definitely not. You start to explain the scale of impact, and that's really what the environmental planning process is for: is to look at what's the current condition, what's the change that's going to happen from that condition by the project, what's the magnitude of that change, and then what are the potential effects or known effects. And I think it's really important to scale the analysis to the potential effects. You could think of, you're going to permit a new roof on your house or cut down a hazard tree in a campground or brush a road. That's pretty simple analysis. You're going to do trails work, probably up there with sort of like a prescribed fire or a small thinning project. And you could go out, the most complex project would be, say, build an airport, which we're not proposing. But the environmental review needs to fit the scale of the potential impact of the project. And there's a lot of discretion, I think, for the landowner to help determine what those are with specialists. So you're not doing an airport analysis for a trail, basically.
Yeah, we did some calculations with connected communities, and 550 miles of single track, which we put it at 30 inches, was actually kind of on the wider side of the trails we like to build. Is 267 acres of disturbance. And then when you amplify that with this 100-foot wide corridor being, let's call it healthy forests, it'd be 6,700 acres of healthy forests along those corridors. So, with these, like the last fire in Loyalton, I want to say was like, 4,000 or 5,000 acres. And, the fire in Portola this last summer was around 4,000 acres as well. So, and those are just little blips now compared to, when it gets serious and we're seeing 50,000, 60,000 or, bigger.
It's interesting too within that corridor. And Stu, sorry, I mean, but that for the animals, especially the ground level animals, it to some it may seem like they're maybe losing some of their habitat, but in reality, it looks to me like we're in, and I'm not an environmental specialist by any means, but we're really enhancing the habitat within that corridor for them, as really the entire forest probably would have been similar to, had humans not really aggressively got in and stopped doing what Mother Nature has been doing for, thousands, if not millions of years. And even, once the native peoples were in this area long before we came here, their forest practices included prescribed fire. I think to me that it's probably, I find it kind of sad that we can only do the 100-foot wide corridor, but we have to start somewhere. And I mean, shoot, I mean, I'm an animal when it comes to the end. And if there's a fire in the forest and the path of least resistance is down this treated corridor 100-foot wide to get the hell out of Dodge, man, I'm following the trail. And I can imagine that animals are probably smart enough to do the same thing.
Marty, if I could comment on the animal thing just for half a second. I was a wildlife biologist in my career for 5 or 6 years with state parks, and I studied it. And just because we cut some vegetation down doesn't mean we're taking away habitat. We're changing the habitat, and every animal species on the planet has a habitat that they like, right? And that habitat overlaps with other habitats. And so if you change the habitat in one spot, you're just creating habitat for something else. You're just basically moving it around a little bit. And I think we lose track of that sometimes. When we look at this stuff and we overanalyze the small changes on the landscape in that way.
Yeah, those are very good points. And I mean, it changes daily with or without us. And I think if we can be on the positive side of that change, and I think fire hardened trails is, again, one small step, one additional tool in the toolbox to do so. But in a vacuum, of even just us on this phone call between a trail building stewardship, both of you that just have decades and decades of experience, both with fire, land management, forest stewardship. I mean, the accolades, could go on and on. But for someone from the general public, what's their role in? It doesn't necessarily have to be direct to the fire hardened trail, but definitely they would be a part of it as trail users. But community support, obviously, we want. But how can the community, be invested and get involved in this and well? And I know, Jason, you work closely too with organizations that reach out and touch the community and bring them into the fold. But what would be, with a fire hardened trail and this type of forest management, what would the community's role be?
Yeah, I think, and I've learned really, through your organization, the value of these trails for the community. I used it to be a user. I'd go out and ride my bike, go walk or whatever. But we have helped coach the local bike team and help support that team. And I can see, I think understanding the value that these trails bring to not just the community, but individual people. And those individual people are all of us, all the folks in the community. So that's number one, is just understanding the value of the trails. And a lot of times I think what you see on public lands is usually people form their own alliance around their own interest, and then they like or don't like the other things that they feel oppose it. When I look at especially trails, they really do provide this broader sort of, I guess, a big tent, for everybody who can access and use them. So understanding that value, and then if they want to help and they can, supporting the volunteer work, the volunteer days, just getting out there and supporting, work on the ground. I think it's important to understanding what these trails are, especially if you haven't spent a lot of time on them. Just go out and look at them, see what it's really about, especially if you're worried about them. Go walk on one of them, go bike on one of them, see what it's really like.
Stu, as a quote firefighter and trail user, um, what would how do you think their perspective is different, from the crews that you work with? I mean, literally, those from Forest Service, Cal Fire, boots on the ground, your colleagues, to those that are your friends that are maybe outside the world of fire and forest management, but still use the trails. Do you think there's a different perception there that's consistent, or, do you think that the normal community, kind of can take that perspective as a firefighter walking on the trail, or do you just think they're oblivious?
Well, I'm not going to claim that people are oblivious to stuff. They're far more sensitive than we give them credit for. And let's also recognize that firefighters are also trail users. There are so many people that are just such top athletes out there, and yeah, they fight fire for a living too. But when you're getting yourself down into that mindset of, okay, I'm fighting a fire, right, or I'm writing a fire plan for an area, you're thinking about those things on the landscape that are going to help you. How am I going to get in there? How am I going to get crews out of there safely? It's not so much about getting in; it's about making sure they can get out. And what is it going to do for me, right? And so in the situation where I'm fighting a big wildfire, I'm looking at situations where I can come in, make a stand, push the fire back, slow it down, things like that. Roads work really well for that type of stuff in high intensity situations. Trails work really well for that kind of stuff in medium to low intensity situations. And we can bring crews into those areas before the fire gets there and really start doing a lot of work before the fire hits that spot. I'm just thinking about Mount Huff. We keep talking about that today, and it's a good example. Let's say the fire is over in Meadow Valley, and we got crews over on Mount Huff going, okay, we got to get ready. We know it's coming over here. Here's a great trail that goes across this spot. What do we need to do to prep for the fire approaching, right? Usually we start cutting things down. We start bringing in hose if we can. Where are we going to position water sources, things like that? If the trail has already been pre-treated, we use that word treatment, right, in the landscape a lot. If it's already been pre-treated with a fire-hardened prescription, there's far less we need to do. We can get in there, get some more stuff done, fire off of it maybe. Maybe we're confident enough to fire off of it. And we can do more of that prep because we didn't have to do as much right now while the fire's coming.
I think that, and you make very good points there too. And I think that probably lands on all of our shoulders when, dealing with the general public and trail users that, if you can just plant that seed, so that just a normal everyday trail user that has nothing to do with forest management or fire, but they're just thinking back there as they're enjoying the trail, enjoying the beauty of it, hopefully seeing some great flora and fauna that they can also look at it and go, you know what? I'm glad this is here, and I'm glad this corridor is here because it makes me feel a little bit better knowing that my home that's a few miles away, has this one additional tool, in the toolbox to help prevent, my family losing everything that they have, in a fire. So I think that those communications, it's like anything else, you can, once that seed starts to grow and, one of those old, Vidal Sassoon commercials, or whatever it was, they tell two friends and they tell two friends, I'm hoping that's the way that this one takes off, much like maybe a mega fire does, except we're moving in the positive direction instead of towards the black. So,
man, for a second there, I thought you were going to actually sing the Vidal Sassoon little jingle, maybe next time.
We don't want that. I think the podcast platforms would drop dirt magic from from all of their platforms if I start singing. That's for sure.
But what's really important about this stuff is educating people. People really appreciate being educated about things. And you can't necessarily expect a seed to grow or blossom, right, until you plant the seed, right? And so doing a little bit of education along with the trail hardening work, I think will go a long way to respecting the community who is, considers those trails a critical part of their lifestyle. Right. And if they know a little bit more about, well, why are you doing that in the forest? Right. All the different forest management projects I've done on the ground. I did a lot of work in Tahoe, for instance. Man, I cannot tell you how many people stop and question everything you're doing. And it's okay. It comes from the heart. It comes from pure, they're just curious. And if you address that and meet that curiosity with wholehearted, a good approach to telling them what you're doing and why you made the decision to do this and what the big picture is, they really appreciate that. And then, they tell two people and they tell two more. So.
Yeah, it is. It is so much just like we can't do this without answering questions and educating people. Like it's not going to work, like they have to have buy-in. And for so many people on a trail on public lands, that's their first time on public lands or their introduction to recreating in the woods. So it really is our chance to not change their mind, but like educate them, familiarize them, let them know what we're up to, why this is healthy. And then the next time, there's a proposition that they're voting on, maybe they vote, for it instead of against it, because now they have an understanding. And then, our agencies and organizations are funded to do this important work. So we can't do it without education. And, that includes, campaigns through social media and through, signage at trailheads and even along the trails, again, like Mount Huff and Quincy is like, what a showpiece. Like you start at the top where, like nothing might grow there in our lifetime, and then you move down the hill and there's some pretty severe burn, but there's still some standing trees, but a lot of brush is growing. And then you move down a little further and even have such a great showpiece because there was projects happening out there, like fuels projects where there's, you move into a healthy forest, where the trees are spaced and you can see through the woods. And then you move down the hill into an area that hasn't been treated, that when it burns, it's going to burn like the top, So just to have those places along one trail that you can educate people on kind of 5 different environments of fire and potential fire. And that mountain sees thousands of people a year. It's a great classroom.
That's a great way to put it, Greg. It's a great classroom, and that's a really good, great term to use. With that, currently the stewardship, we are building literally as we speak, new trail on Mount Huff. And are we able to enact any part of this prescription yet? Like our crews, at least for their part and what we're qualified to do, have we tried to start incorporating some of this fire prescription into our current trail building? Or are we still in a position where we definitely need to get some more agencies together to at least do our part?
Well, the NEPA was done prior to fire hardened trails on the trails that we're working on. So there is no prescription for treatment. I mean, we are dealing with the aftermath, on some of these trails, like Indian Falls Ridge, which takes off to the north of Huff, where there was some severe burn. It's constant log out, like Henry, who's our trail boss, provided us a report last week, and there's been over 700 trees that they've had to remove that have fallen. Almost 500 crew hours just in log out. And the last time they went in, they took out over 100 trees. And on the way back to the truck at the end of the day, they had to take out 5 more that had fallen while they were doing that log out. So, we're trying to just keep those trails open and safe now, and again, like if this treatment was in and these trees were spaced better, maybe it wouldn't have burned as hot and it would have protected the trail. So, part of this is also like trail protection, resource protection for the trail, so that we're not having to, send in crews to do this dangerous work. And the public's not in a dangerous situation by being around trees that are continuously falling. So our hope is a big winter, couple like healthy windstorms in the winter that just takes them all down. So we're cleaning it up.
Yeah, and that's I'm really looking forward to when we can really incorporate this, moving forward in all trail building, and even just beyond us. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, Greg, too, that it'll be great when this prescription just becomes a part of trail building, just like the other aspects of trail building are now. And gentlemen, I know we're pushing time here, so I'm going to start wrapping up, and we'll do some final thoughts. But there was a paragraph that I read earlier, and Jason, this will be to you and Stu really, but it's there. There was one term in it that I especially like, but I'm going to read the short paragraph real quick because it's very, very technical. Forest and fire ecologists and managers recommend that taking a silviculture approach to management actions requires consideration and incorporation of wildfire as an anticipated disturbance, and suggests that management actions that build in mechanical treatments to augment acre points, ecosystem assets, and revenue considerations in project planning. Boy, that's a mouthful, and very detailed. But in my mind, it sounds like kind of like a fire hardened trail. Really checks a lot of boxes in that paragraph.
You had me at pyrosilviculture.
that's the whole reason that I even brought that paragraph, because I saw that word and I went, oh, I like that just because of the word. I hope that's a positive thing. Pyrosilviculture.
It's a great word. And I know it piqued Jason's interest too, because that's practically what he does for a living. Right, Jason? I mean, that's what we've been studying and doing as foresters for a long time. It's been the ultimate goal.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people, Ryan Tompkins and Rob York at Blodgett Forest and others who've operationalized these ideas. I know Malcolm North. There's a lot of people. I think in general, there's this basically the assumption that you're going to have a fire in your landscape at some point. You can't know exactly when and where, but probably every acre in the state that's available to burn is going to burn at some point. And sometimes it'll give you the conditions that give you the fire effects you want, and sometimes it won't. I think the park fire actually is a great example. You can't know that someone's going to start a fire somewhere. You can know that it's going to have this potential fire behavior. Um, and that fire is really kind of demonstrates the conditions that this landscape is in when it's really dry and windy. Again, you can have fires that burn and do exactly great things and create great habitat and clean up. So not all fires are bad. We're not implying that. But I think much like earthquakes, you design homes for 8 or 9 earthquake. You know it's going to come at some point. But if you try and think that it's never going to happen or this won't happen to us or some air tanker will catch it, that's where you're going to get caught and lose stuff because you just can't keep fire out of these ecosystems forever. They're going to burn. You just don't know when and where.
Just like it's going to rain again someday, it's going to burn again someday. So we need to plan for it.
Yep, I certainly hope so. Both on the selfish reasons for how good it makes our trails, that for the growing season as well. But which can also be a catch-22. Good rains means a lot of growth. But well, gentlemen, this has been a great conversation, and this is something that's going to continue on. And we're really, just at the beginning of this. Although, in my opinion, this concept has been around long before we ever stepped foot on this continent. But final thoughts for those listening, in this fire hardened trail, what would you want to leave the listeners with? And Stu, we'll start with you.
I think at the most basic sense is let's leave our minds open to what needs to be done out there, and let's try something new. This is just such a progressive concept. It's being picked up and thought about and talked about by a lot of people. And understand that forest and fire managers are trying to do the right thing for the right reasons. And this new partnership we're building, let's move forward with it. Let's celebrate it.
Thank you very much, Stu. And Jason, within that Patagonia film Fire Lines, you were in the local museum here, Plumas County Museum, and looking at a news article. Literally, it was from 100 years ago, and it mentioned, the dangers of not doing what we're talking about doing now. Which is the irony of that is when you can, boy, even if you just put that as a starting point and look what, they obviously ignored that writer in that newspaper. Not enough people read that newspaper and took it to heart. So, again, moving in a positive direction, what would you leave folks listening today with, not only Fire Hardened Trail, but how they can help and be involved?
Well, I think one, understanding just integrating disturbance and fire and treatments into these landscapes is key, and fire hardened trails can be a big part of that. I think for people that have concerns about trails, whether they're horseback riders, mountain bike riders, hikers, motorcycle riders, um, work with your local group. So every region, has a group. There's Tamba, there's others, in Lake Tahoe. Uh, Learn about the trails, talk to the people who are working with them. Um, don't just take the word from something that you read or something that you hear. Get out there and experience them. And if there's something that you don't like or want to improve, try and get involved in the process early. Like, get your input in. Maybe you need a more accessible trail. You're someone who can't get around or even use a walker or mobility device. Those are important things to bring in early in the process. That, like Greg said, if we start early, we can address a lot of things. But yeah, I would say, especially if you're a visitor to an area from outside, maybe learn what the locals think a little bit about these trails and how they use them. And I'm sure there's folks who will talk to you and share that can get in touch, maybe through your organization to individuals if they wanted.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And thanks, Jason. And that's a great segue, Greg. We as an organization, the stewardship, we have trail work days, we have epics, we have events. And, we're beginning to bring the fire hardened trail prescription out more and more to the public and really engaging with folks. And, what are your final thoughts on what we plan to do as an organization to help bring the message to the people?
Yeah, I think right now it's important for people just to start, like, it's in conversations. Fire hardened trails becomes a known thing, and it's part of NEPA, it's part of CEQA, and I think right now is, Stu and Jason and I think we're the spokespeople in a way, like we're proud of this prescription, what it could mean, like we're really good friends with Ryan Tompkins. Like, it's important, I think, for each of us to carry this forward. And if anybody has questions, if you're a land manager, if you're a fire captain, like, reach out to us. I think we'd all, be available to answer any questions. And if you have other ideas about how this could be used, I think we're open to that too. So I think just getting it out there, getting it known, and getting it accepted, so that, again, it is part of every NEPA, CEQA trail project in the future, and start taking care of this place and each other. I think it's more important now than ever.
I agree fully, and we want this conversation to echo for generations to come. I mean, we're doing it for ourselves selfishly now, but investing in all of our friends and families, children's future, including our own. So, well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I know, obviously, your time is always super important and busy. I'm actually, what we're talking about today is what you do in your daily lives. So I appreciate your time, and thanks a lot for being on the show. And I look forward to not only seeing you guys out on the trail, but conversation events. And folks, if you are listening, always, stay tuned to the Sierra Beach Trail Stewardship social media through Instagram, Facebook, sierratrails.org. You can get on our email list there and stay up and current on fire hardened trails. And you will continue to hear from Stu and Jason and Greg as we move forward in doing our small part and hoping to keep these public lands as safe and fire free as possible when we can. For generations to come. So, gentlemen, again, thanks for joining me, and all of you have a great day out there and stay safe.
Thanks, Marty.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Dirt Magic, the podcast, brought to you by the good people of the Sierra Buttes Trail Stewardship. For future and past shows, visit dirtmagicpodcast.com or search for us on your favorite listening platform. Music by The Saddle Tramps. To learn more about supporting the SBTS and upcoming events, visit sierratrails.org. I'm Martin Scheel, and I'll see you out on the trails. Thanks again for listening.